Hello, and welcome everyone to How the World Was Built. A little bit of a change from the previous topic. My name is Ranu Bopana. I'm a past president of the MIT South Asian Alumni Association. First of all, a huge thank you to Arun and Fran Alagappan for making this event possible. And a huge thank you as well to JLF for inviting us to this year's festival. We're thrilled to be here. You are in for a treat today, a one-of-a-kind discussion that I believe will change how you think about the world and universities. For me, this all started when I wondered, when did the first South Asian come to MIT? It turns out it was 1880, and I was stunned to learn this fact. It was shortly after MIT's founding and a century before I arrived on campus. Around the same time, I saw an exhibit by Professor Emma Teng called China Comes to Tech, which showed Chinese students were also at MIT in the 1880s. Who knew? Professor Teng told me that she'd also found records of South Asian students in her research, and she was just waiting for someone to come ask about them. She introduced me to Professor Sana Aiyar, who brilliantly expanded this research beyond engineering to all of MIT and beyond India to all of South Asia. She's the research director for the exhibit South Asia and the Institute. Inspired by this, Professor Hiromu Nagahara curated an exhibit on MIT's first Japanese students. And the exhibit was called From Samurai into Engineers. But long before any of us, Professor Craig Wilder was doing groundbreaking research uncovering the ties between universities and slavery, including MIT, with his book, Ebony and Ivy. We realized that a conversation between these four historians would be absolutely mesmerizing. We also put together the booklets, which you can pick up outside, to give you a taste of these histories. So why does this matter? MIT was our nation's first global university. In 1910, a full 10% of its student body was international, far more than any other peer at the time. And as a premier tech institute, MIT is also literally where the future is built. Understanding its global past is crucial to navigating the present. And I can't think of a better person to lead this discussion than Arun Venugopal, a senior reporter for WNYC covering race, immigration, and identity. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Arun. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranu. Oh, and happy birthday, Ranu. Everybody wish her a happy birthday. Thank you, Facebook. Thanks you so much to all of you, and of course, thank you to all of you who are scholars and have done this rigorous work that is shaped as public histories. What I want to do is talk about what it means to have public histories, but also what the meaning is of not just MIT, but the academy, and an idea that is perhaps amongst America's sort of greatest exports, right? These places that are so idyllic in the public imagination worldwide, and which we're now seeing are not necessarily quite so idyllic. And I think the public histories each of you really shaped are really important ways of understanding what we are encountering right now when it comes to this country, its own history, and how students and scholarship intersect with our nation's history. So let's just kind of interrogate that idea for a second. Public histories. We're seeing so much of a challenge to institutions of higher education. We're seeing students get taken off the streets without warning. A lot of students who are abroad, perhaps, well, certainly second-guessing their decisions as to whether they're going to come to these esteemed institutions or not. But tell me about right now, Craig, let's start with you. how does the role of the historian, your role, suddenly shift at moments like this? It's highly contentious moments where the work of the university and of experts and of expertise itself, when all that becomes highly politicized, does it make your work that much harder?
Yes. Yes, it certainly makes it harder. But I think actually the real challenge is that these are the moments when historians engaged with students actually can do some of our most productive and most meaningful work. The work of doing history for me is social work. It's actually giving back. And when my students are engaged in those projects, it's actually a chance for us to really actually bring to life what a university is. And a university for me is not a place where we sort of, build fancy buildings and hoard books, but it's a place where we take knowledge and actually share it as liberally, as generously, as radically, as recklessly as we can.
And just to elaborate, when you say it makes it harder, how viscerally are you feeling that at this moment?
I think across our department, across our campus, and across universities, across colleges and universities across the United States, we're feeling these pressures in very real ways because, as what you described, we're talking about, people, and often vulnerable people, and vulnerable people who are striving for something that defines many of our own life experiences, an aspiration to gain knowledge and transform one's own life, and to see that interrupted or threatened is beyond frightening to me.
So I'd like to bring in the rest of you, Sana and Emma and Hiromu. When did classes start? About a week ago? Does it feel different? Do you have students you're expecting to see who didn't return to campus or expressing things to you that you hadn't heard in the past?
So I was expecting things to be quite different. In terms of the numbers of students who have been international students who received visas or are still waiting for visas, those numbers actually are smaller than I thought they would be. And that makes me reflect on narrative and public narratives about what is happening on the ground. Often the pressures that university spaces feel are part of a larger spectacle. And the point of these pressures really is the rhetoric and the discourse, the sense of the uncertainty, the ambiguity that is, and that is the point. No one really cares so much in terms of those who are putting pressure about actually what is happening on the ground. So although the students, I was expecting things to be a little bit different, the students have come in. Many of the students who were international didn't actually leave over the summer over fears of not being able to return into the country. And I spent most of the summer in India where every second conversation was about parents whose children were either thinking about applying to the US or had received offer letters and weren't sure if they'll be able to come in or not. And I think that it is that uncertainty that is really the point of these kinds of pressures and not so much the reality on the ground. And that really is the stuff of what historians do to really unpack the reality, the facts, the evidence from the discourse, and really think about what is the intention of a certain discourse that may not represent the reality, but still has very real effects in terms of people's own responses, reactions, and actual decisions that impact both the university and the institutions, as well as one's personal sort of experiences in that.
Emma, did you have something to add, or either of you?
Well, I think I'm feeling it in some sense slightly from a different angle. So in the classes I teach, Japanese history classes, I teach one class called Inventing the Samurai last spring. A lot of the students who took my class actually went to Japan later that summer as interns. So MIT has this wonderful program called MISTY, where we send out students to all over the world during the summer. And in fact, it reminded me that there are lots of things going on here, but there are also multiple global contexts, right? And so what's going on here didn't necessarily keep our students from going abroad. And one of the things that I've been noticing in my classes, in fact, this resurgence of interest in Japan. Japan, as many of you may know, is a very popular tourist destination these days. There's a lot of different interests in Japanese culture. And I've had the pleasure of teaching my students the early histories of the very first Japanese students at MIT who came over here in a context where they were actually learning that history to go over to Japan. And so over the course of the summer, I actually emailed them and heard from them about their own sort of adventures in Japan and of them sort of experiencing Japan, as a real place with warts and all, as people who actually live there now during the summer. And so, it was heartening to see that part, despite all the things that are going on. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from sort of their reports from the summer as I see them on campus this fall.
So the work does go on.
The work does go on, yeah. And the world, there are global contexts happening, yeah.
Emma?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a wonderful question. And this moment, I think, really forced me to reflect on my own privilege. I think a lot of my peers that I interact with, we're here in this country because our parents came to the United States as graduate students, in search of higher education, in search of opportunities, but in my father's case also to move away from authoritarian Taiwan, And so they were really pursuing a particular American dream that I think I grew up taking for granted. But we see at this moment now that it's that pathway for students to come here, to gain educations, to make a new life, to have their families free from authoritarianism, that is not something we can take for granted anymore.
Yeah. You touched upon privilege. Hiromu, you touched upon the identity, the idea of the samurai. Both ideas I want to get at the people who are coming here. But let's just go to the early days of MIT. Craig, there's this sentence on the public history that you oversaw that's online. As MIT entered its first decades, let me just back up. Just for those of you who don't know, most of you probably don't know, I think it was the first class was admitted in 1865, correct? First class of students. So this is a university which is kind of taking birth at the very sunset of the Civil War. But as is written here, as MIT entered its first decades, slavery and colonialism were neither history nor mere legacies. Could you expand upon that, please?
Well, first, I'll blame the students for that line.
Sure.
The student, I actually think the students wrote that line. I may have edited it, but it was the students in the MIT and Slavery course and MIT's Indigenous History course that I believe crafted those lines. And what they meant by that was that the founding of MIT was so intimately tied to slavery and colonialism. But in fact, in a broader sense, the history of the American Academy was so intimately tied to those historical events and processes that there is no history of MIT without them, No college or university survives the colonial period without attaching itself to the slave economy. No college or university makes it to the Civil War without actually finding a niche in this emerging modern economy. And so MIT, the story of engineering, and the story of engineering's rise within the academy as a legitimate field of study, is in fact actually a story of the relationship between the modern economy and the slave economy.
Just one example that this project sort of reveals to us is that so much of the work in 19th century engineering and science, mining, for instance, was done by enslaved people whose work was just invisibilized, correct?
Yeah, it's largely erased and forgotten, but when I tried to explain what we were going to do in the course to MIT's senior officers, I explained that the great engineering project of the 17th and 18th centuries is the slave ship. And the great engineering project of the 19th century is either the railroad or the cotton manufactory, but they're fraternal twins. That in fact, actually engineering emerges as a legitimate academic pursuit and enters the academy as a pursuit with both funding and formalizing precisely because it's in service to the slave economy.
Let's talk about the founder of MIT, William Barton Rogers. Came from a family of many abolitionists, but he and his wife owned a number of enslaved people before moving to Boston. Why does this matter to MIT and its history?
I think it matters because the story of those people matter. One of the hardest things that one of the biggest challenges that our students faced in the class was actually something quite simple. Can we find the names of the people who the Rogers family held enslaved at William and Mary and at the University of Virginia, where William Barton Rogers, MIT's founder, worked? And the answer for actually a couple of years was no. And then over the last 5 years, we've started to find their names. And it's my sense, and I think my students' sense, that they deserve as much memorialization as William Barton Rogers does. And in fact, actually, if you look at Rogers' history, one of Rogers' chief assistant was an enslaved man. In Virginia, over by the University of Virginia, in the 19th century, people actually actively recalled Rogers going to do his field work in geology with an enslaved man named Levi. Levi was his research assistant. Levi stood in for William Barton Rogers when William Barton Rogers was absent. Levi took people on geological tours, visitors from Europe, on geological tours of the Virginia countryside. Levi actually is an extraordinary figure, but Levi stands in for, in many ways, the thousands of people who actually served on the University of Virginia campus and who we're only now starting to remember and whose lives we're only now starting to reconstruct. Their contributions are only starting. As our students asked, what do we do with science when enslaved people help produce it? Do we forget them? Or do we actually change what we think about science and we think about engineering, not to erase it, but in fact to tell a more three-dimensional story of how it evolved?
So let's talk about the university and why it started bringing in students from other countries and other non-white populations, and the extent to which their work was appreciated or invisibilized or squelched by classmates. Emma, some of the first students from China, they started coming in the 1870s, am I right? What years were they?
Yeah, the first student to come to MIT from China was in 1877. And in fact, this story surprisingly links with Craig's story of MIT's relationship with slavery through cotton, as well as the railways. Because a number of the earliest Chinese students to come to MIT or to come to Massachusetts wanted to study textile manufacturing. And so one of our first students to come over here from China was starting off at the Mechanical Arts Institute. Later, students came to the Lowell Textile Institute, which was also affiliated with MIT in those early years. And so there is this link of students coming over and wanting to learn the technology to industrialize and modernize China's textile manufacture. The other link with cotton was that US manufacturers were very, very eager to sell cotton shirts in particular, to China. And that became a way for the New England textile manufacturers to kind of have a renaissance of their own ability to manufacture because they were selling shirts in China. So that history of cotton and industrial manufacture really forms a surprising, to me at least, tie between the history of Chinese students at MIT and this earlier history of slavery.
So 1877, 5 years later, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Is it clear how the leaders of MIT were responding to this, pushing back, silent on the issue of exclusion? First ethnic national group that is excluded from the country, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's right. That's the first group to be named specifically as a national or racial group for exclusion from this country. But as you might be familiar, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882, specifically targeted unskilled workers. And so it carved out a number of exemptions for this exclusion, and one of those exemptions was students. So students were still welcomed to this country as a kind of exceptional category. And part of the reason that they were welcomed was the idea that by bringing students over and educating them and acculturating them into American values, they would later then serve as a channel for disseminating those values, whether it's values of liberalism or democracy, free speech, etc., Christianity, to Asian and other countries. And so there was a kind of self-interest in a lot of ways of Americans welcoming students here. But they nonetheless experienced harassment, as I documented in my China Comes to MIT website. Despite the fact that they were privileged immigrants and allowed to come to this country, a lot of them were harassed at the borders, and also were prevented really by racism from taking jobs in the United States after they finished their degrees, right? So this was a real double thing. And MIT, I'm proud to say, was extremely supportive of the early students from China, and the faculty, in fact, wrote a letter of protest about some of these exclusionary acts toward the Chinese.
One student, Li Ting-chen, I'm not sure who you're referring to, but wrote in 1918 about Chinese students who encountered ignorance and condescension from their classmates. You can take that very broadly. What sort of things are we talking about? Do you know?
Well, we're talking about, on the most innocuous level perhaps, a sense of condescension, that China didn't really have civilization, that it was dirty, backwards, that America was more advanced, more science and modernity, all the way to very racist depictions of Chinese, racist cartoons, racist slurs, the word chink. That kind of racial discrimination was also existing. So it was a real spectrum of the kind of racism that the students were facing at MIT and in the greater Boston area.
Let's talk about Japan for a minute. Hiromu, you write that the first students who come over, they're themselves samurai, correct?
That's right.
And they're coming from really the top of the social order, aren't they?
That's right.
What drew them here, and how were they treated when they were here?
So I think it connects to what Emma was just saying about how even for Chinese students, people who did come over here, people who did go to MIT, are in some sense in the elite, right, of their society. And I think that's doubly so, as you just alluded to in the case of Japan, where the very first generation of students who come from Japan are literally born into samurai families who nominally form the ruling class of Japan, about 6 to 7% of the total population. The ruling class from 1600s until the year 1868, when a political event known as the Meiji Restoration sort of kicks off the process that turns Japan into a constitutional monarchy and abolishes samurai along the way. But the first MIT student who came to MIT from Japan, a guy named Eiichiro Honma, arrived to Boston in 1867, a year before this political turmoil. And he was not alone. There were a couple dozen Japanese students in Boston area at that time going to different schools. And so they collectively experienced, while they're in Boston, sort of this political upheaval that's going on in Japan. And most of them managed to continue to study, stay, eventually return. Most of them go back to Japan and participate in building the modern Japanese state. And so for these students, there is a sense that they did come from the ruling class. And in fact, what their training at MIT, at Harvard, at Yale, at Rutgers enables them to do is to become part of the new modern ruling class of Japan as engineers, as jurists, as government officials, as military officers. And so for them, their experience in Boston, and largely in the East Coast, seemed to be largely positive, at least from their personal perspective. There are sort of indications even in the diary of Honma, the first Japanese guy at MIT, that they did encounter sort of petty racism kind of on a daily basis. But by and large, they're welcome, they're allowed to study, and if you actually look at local Massachusetts newspapers around that time reporting on these students, they're very positive, largely speaking, almost cheering them on as they're studying and remarking on how capable these students are. And so I think there was a sense of welcome, and I think that there's an interpersonal sense of welcome that's heartening in some sense from modern day perspective. But I think if you zoom out a little bit, the story gets a little bit complicated, because I think it does become partly about Japan and United States both emerging as imperial powers surrounding the Pacific. And there is a kind of partnership of newly emerging imperial powers. And that becomes much more explicit as we go into the 20th century, when United States and Japan, for example, are allies during the First World War. And it really only breaks down in the course of 1930s when Japan's military expansion into Asia accelerates in incredibly violent fashion, and that leads to a backlash in the United States. But in 1921, for example, the second Japanese student to graduate from MIT, a guy named Takuma Dunn, class of 1878, mining engineering, he comes to MIT in 1921 and is given a hero's welcome. He's allowed to give a speech to a convocation of everyone at MIT from the president on down. And he reminisces about his time at MIT, but also calls on the students to continue to value US-Japan relations. And by the time Don gave this speech, he was the head of Mitsui, one of the largest, most powerful financial industrial conglomerates in Japan at that time, along with Mitsubishi, which might be a better known name in America. And in part because of that, Don, continues to sort of act as a bridge between the financial and industrial worlds of the United States and Japan, between the Japanese and United States government. And when, in 1932, he is assassinated by a far-right Japanese activist, precisely because he is the head of Mitsui, he's seen as a symbol of American-style capitalism, that becomes one of the signs of Japan going into a different direction, apart, away from America, in much more confrontational and contentious political direction.
And some of that rupture that you pointed to in terms of between from the old to the new, you note that there were a couple of students who soon after arriving in the 1860s, they were stuck here, but they lost their status. Am I right? Samurai status. And they felt sort of freed from this thing that had been sort of stripped from them. Could you explain this and why they would feel freed and how it shaped their futures in interesting ways?
Sure. So, in the status system, at least the ideal was that you were born into a samurai family, you would pursue samurai pursuits. And oftentimes what that meant during the Tokugawa period, the last samurai government, was that you would serve as some kind of governor within your local, what in English we call samurai domains, daimyo domains. In fact, only a sliver of those total samurai population ever actually were able to get those positions. And so one of the things that historians of Tokugawa period will tell you is that actually most samurai were unemployed or underemployed. But if you showed ability, you were able to, especially towards the last half century or so, sort of get into government positions. But your life course was in some sense set for you. And so the fact that these students in the course of 1870s lose their samurai status means that some of those students who came to America thinking, well, maybe because I'm born a samurai, I should become a soldier, I should go to military academy, like Homa did, the first guy who came to MIT, are now free to pursue other things. And so in the case of Homa, he decides, well, I want to learn how to become a railroad engineer. I want to build railroad in Japan. And he does that. He goes back to Japan and works for the Japanese government, eventually building railroad all over Japan. And that's the story for all of these students who come to America, and a smaller number who go to Europe from Japan in this period. They come to their foreign destinations thinking I'll do one thing, but oftentimes end up doing other things that actually end up helping them sort of, again, become part of the new ruling elite, ironically.
I'm just kind of wondering if these ever prompted those awkward conversations. Kid goes back home, he's like, I don't want to be pre-med, I want to study post-structuralist cinema, kind of thing like that. It's like, and dad's like, what are you talking about? Underwater basket weaving, what is that? There must have been some sort of tensions there at home, right?
Absolutely, and I think actually for many of them, including the first couple students who came to MIT from Japan, one of the things that they don't do is they don't go back to their home province. So if they were still samurai, if it was still the government of samurai, they would have had to gone back to their home domains, in this case, Fukuoka in northern Kyushu, which is a beautiful, wonderful city. No, I'm not dissing Fukuoka, but these students wanted to go to Tokyo, the center of the new centralizing, modernizing, industrializing national government. And that's where, in many cases, they ended up. We do get a story of a student from Japan in the 1920s who come to MIT, who was basically told by his father that you're going to become a mechanical engineer and I will buy you an auto repair factory in Japan. And the father made this promise because he realized that this is a guy named Horiuchi. His son was way too interested in music. And Western classical music and jazz and things like that. And so Horiuchi says, okay, I'll go do that. He goes to Michigan, studies mechanical engineering, and then he does masters at MIT. Then he goes back to Japan, but while he's in Michigan and in Boston, he goes to concerts. In fact, he comes to New York to concerts. He buys phonographs, and he does not become an owner of a auto factory when he goes back to Japan. He becomes one of the foremost introducers of jazz in Japan in the 1930s, including not so much jazz, but this pop tune from the 1920s called My Blue Heaven. He translates that into Japanese, and to this day, many Japanese people will be able to recognize that tune because it became such a popular song thanks to Mr. Horiuchi, despite his promises to his father.
So, Sana, let's talk about 100 years ago, you have Indian students who are coming here, including after the Johnson-Reed Act in the Asiatic Barred Zone Act in 1917, the Johnson-Reed Act in 1920s. Indians have been denaturalized, very few remaining, but these students keep on coming in, don't they? This certain set of elite students, and by the 1920s and 30s, they're really using their voice to champion the nationalist cause back home, aren't they?
So, colonialism presents itself in different ways across the world. And we heard from Craig about the experience of MIT and American colonialism and slavery. But for Indian students from South Asia, where India was under British rule, MIT and the US was actually a space of refuge from British colonialism. And the relationship of South Asian students to MIT has been one of decolonization, and three moments in which this decolonization happens, which is why you find that, in fact, despite the immigration rules that make it very clear that students can come in, but they can't stay, which is very different from the present-day context in which a lot of students from South Asia and across the world come to the US, it was not a pathway to immigrating permanently and gaining American citizenship, but really the push factor was more to develop the skill set that was needed in scientific and technological expertise to be able to go back to India and build companies, factories, things like manufacturing a tube light or a bulb as part of the nationalist movement that was known as Swadeshi, which was about economic and therefore political self-reliance. And so the push or the attraction to come to MIT, you had asked a question earlier, why was MIT sort of soliciting all of these students? It was actually the other way around, where it was the students pushing to come in, and the first few students, in fact, were not even, and these were highly qualified, very elite, English-speaking scientists and engineers who had, in fact, done an undergraduate degree in India at the top colonial universities. And for them to be able to establish an Indian-run university or Indian-owned factories, they needed to requalify because, in fact, MIT and other universities wouldn't recognize their degrees. And so they would come in, essentially as special students, and then eventually they were allowed in to get formal degrees. And for them, it really was about this nation-building project to gain the expertise that they wanted, to be able to go back and actually participate in a meaningful way in Swadeshi Swadeshi and to show the British that in fact they did not need, need to work in, colonial or private British-owned factories and schools and universities. So the earliest of students and the first mention of MIT actually shows up in the newspaper of Bal Gangadhar Tilak, a very famous Indian revolutionary, as early as 1884, who says that really there is this model institute of technology in Massachusetts, and Indians should follow that. And today, as you said, MIT is the place that globally people can aspire to. Back in 1884, MIT was not what it is today. And to have this nationalist in his very widely circulated newspaper called Maratha mention and single out MIT as this model institute, I mean, he was a real visionary. And that vision actually gets fulfilled after independence by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who visits MIT 2 years after independence in 1949, to ask the students in India, just as the Loose Cellar Act opened up immigration reforms and Indians were allowed to actually come in and stay, and he handpicks these students to say, India needs engineers, technicians, it needs nation builders. And whether it was engineers or architects or economists, he asks them all to return back to India to get involved in this project of nation building through non-alliance. So politically, he was really sort of keen on keeping India non-allied in the context of the Cold War, but he needed that expertise and calls them back. They all get involved in various large-scale government infrastructural projects, including very famously the Planning Commission that turns to computing as a way of figuring out what are the numbers in terms of the population, what kind of budget we need to have to identify development projects and where that money will be spent. And it's these sort of MIT-trained nationalists who go back and get involved in this. And the most radical idea that he had that sees that sort of really is realized is the setting up of world-class institutes called the Indian Institutes of Technology that Nehru famously said were the real temples of India. And a number of universities from across the world got involved with setting up these IITs. The IIT at Kanpur was set up in collaboration with MIT and became one of the most successful and institutes. And it's at about that time, and this is a government-funded project, both by the Indian government, but also the US government, through agencies like USAID, through the Ford Foundation, through the State Department itself, that after the Second World War had in fact invested heavily in universities in the US, including MIT. And these are really sort of public-private partnerships that are setting up higher education institutes with governments in India that have been extraordinarily successful at a time where, because of Cold War geopolitics, actually US-India relations were really strained. So, for me, again, the students coming in, looking to MIT for this technical expertise and going back, it's all part of that process of decolonization and nation building. But once the 1965 Immigration Act was passed, and India really does take a socialist turn, where there was an investment in higher education, but not so much in primary level education. Engineers who had graduated from IIT who wanted to pursue research, for example, and not necessarily go into government services, found that the PhD programs in the US were now willing to take them in because they had really been well qualified, finally, right, as far as these universities were concerned. And so you have, again, this confluence of events where there is an outflow that there were worries at the time that were referred to as brain drains, but you get sort of large-scale immigration and a process of naturalization within the US that becomes a host country for many Indian engineers. And what you get today, are second, third generation South Asian Americans for whom then these stories are really about, as Emma was saying, the parents, the grandparents who came. And these are real public history stories because it's about their genealogies, not mine, right? I was qualified in India, I grew up there, I came here for my PhD, I didn't go to MIT for my PhD. So in a way, this is not really my private story. It's a public history, but it is these genealogies of the alumni, the students, the faculty, the staff, people who have been working there their entire life, who really sort of think about this moment where MIT becomes a conduit and a real connection between South Asia and the United States.
So I'm getting the time's up warning. I just want to check, do we have any more time? Getting a no. Not my fault, folks. Thanks to all of you. Everyone, please give a big hand to Sana Aiyar, Hiromu Nagahara, Emma Teng, and Craig Wilder.